And now we present to you Thac0 with Advantage.
Welcome to Thac0 with Advantage. We're two friends that have been playing D&D a long time. While we both love lots of other RPGs, D&D gives us a closed set of places to explore. Hi, I'm Ange, and I have been gaming for long enough that it feels like forever, but also feels like I started yesterday. Because I am absolutely obsessed with role-playing games, I started writing for Gnome Stew back in 2014, and I've been doing podcasting about gaming since about 2017, thanks to the Gnomecast.
Why is it 2014 and 2017 don't actually sound like they were that long ago until you do math?
Math sucks the older you get.
Yeah, it's all math's fault. I'm Jared, and for 1,000 generations, I was the guardian of peace and justice in RPGs. Or maybe it was 1,000 years. Those are two different things. It's okay. I'll sort all this out in a parsec. You can find some of my articles on Gnome Stew, as well as my own site, whatdoiknowjr.com. After we look at the games we're running in the campaign journal, we'll be talking about Dungeon Ecology. Then we'll have some recommendations of D&D related content for you to check out in our downtime research segment.
Now stand by for station identification. This is WDND the Role Player. Now we're going to McElroy McKinney and the Bardic College.
So we got rid of that signal, right? Everything's good? Fantastic. Alright. Oh, we're on? My bad. While they were presented in the same manner of locations like the Caves of Chaos or the Tomb of Horrors, many early dungeon adventures in D&D were actually about exploring various locations in ruined cities. The aptly named The Lost City and Dwellers of the Forbidden City are both prime examples. Even some adventures set in the ever-expanding new campaign worlds of Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms, in Dragons of Despair and Ruins of Adventure, continue that tradition. Boy, am I old. I remember those and the moments that they came out. Anyways, the presentation often remained the same, a map with various locations marked with a letter or numbered key, but with fewer moments of wondering where monsters get their food from, or go to the restroom. You know what? Don't think about monsters going to the restroom, it just brings up all the wrong questions. And now I have to pee. Let me just finish up this campaign journal.
In City of Cowls, the game was in person, and it was an awesome day, because it was the 5th of July. So that whole holiday weekend, and the GM and his family have a brand new in-ground swimming pool. So game day turned into an all-day affair with many hours in the pool, then pulled pork, mac and cheese, and then gaming. So it was a beautiful day, especially for this half fish that's talking to you right now, because I love being in the pool. In the game, we dealt with the oncoming horde of demons led by Lungorthan. I'm not sure what type of demon Tristan used as the basis for Lungorthan, but I think he was on par with a Baelor. He didn't say he was a Baelor, he just said he was similar in power to them and in service to a demon prince. At the start of this all, we discussed what we were going to do to prepare for the oncoming horde. This included things like laying traps in the valley below that they would have to approach through, convincing a group of manticores to fight against the demon with the dragon clans, building up morale among all of the troops, and coming up with tactical positioning for clans and us and all of that. What we didn't realize is the GM was tracking all of these things and using them to determine a score that would add to our side's roll against the Horde's roll. He was getting all of this from a source that I forgot to ask him what it was, but it was for large-scale combats like this, and it was pretty cool. We ended up doing well enough with all of our preparation that we had an incredibly high roll compared to the Horde's roll for the first engagement, and we only lost a small percentage of our fighting force, and the Horde lost about a third. I think he had us all take about 20% of our hit points off to represent that we had been in this fight for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it was pretty cool the way he handled it, because I was honestly a little worried about it, because in the past I have played with not so talented GMs who tried to do mass battles, and it usually just ends up being, to be completely crude, game masturbating, because the game master is just sitting there rolling all the dice for themselves, and we're sitting there waiting for them to finish. After that, we had the PCs engage directly with Lungorthan, while the NPCs all dealt with the rest of the Horde. This part was a little more like a traditional game where we basically got to beat up on the big bad. I did have a moment where I quite obviously shortcut the GM's expectations of how that battle was going to go when Dove successfully landed a hold monster on Langorthan. It was at that moment that the GM realized he forgot to give the big bad some legendary saves. And while Langorthan only stayed in the hold for about a round and a half, it was enough that we were able to whittle him down and take him out in a properly epic fashion that still didn't go quite as epic on the GM's side as he thought it was going to. After that, with the horde routed, we settled into a celebration and discussed what we were going to do next. We did have to remind Ree that we had other things we needed to do besides leading all of the Dragonborn clans, but she reluctantly agreed, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I can, you all help me do this, I can go help you do the next parts too. Our next session is also going to be in person, but I'll be hosting this time with no amazing in-ground swimming pool. It happens to be Pride weekend in my hometown. It's a little odd, but historically, my city has celebrated Pride in July since the early 70s, and several of the players are going to be in town for it, so we're just going to play in person after they go to the parade and get sunburned at the festivities.
That sounds cool. I think the most functional mass combat that I've seen is the mass combat that I saw for Savage Worlds. Part of that is because like the player roles contribute to how you determine how many tokens each side gets, and it's, you know, a representative amount of tokens and everything. I really like that. My biggest problem is I've never been able to translate how that works from Savage Worlds into anything else.
Yeah. Mass combat's one of those things that's very genre appropriate, but it can be hard to implement.
Yeah.
In the old Margrave, we started in the village of Lavoca, where I fed them some rumors about various locations and things in the forest, because they asked for some rumors and maybe some side quests. Little did they know, one of the things I wanted them to engage with, I could easily seed in as a rumor and a side quest. A local hunter in the village told them about a place in the forest that felt very wrong, and that she had heard rumors of hunters going missing in that area, and how another family of hunters from the village was headed in that direction and had not yet returned. I did end up with a little bit of a moment with one of the players over this, because he asked if there were any pictures of the missing family. And I snarkily replied that they don't have photography in this fantasy world. It wasn't what he meant, but he did fully expect them to have portraits of the family, like drawings or paintings or whatever. And me being somebody who took art history in college, no, that's not a thing. Having portraiture was a thing of the aristocracy. It was only for the wealthy. And while I know this is a fantasy world and holding it to real world standards isn't necessary, the idea of a medieval-ish village having portraits of the residents just struck me as completely ludicrous. I feel a little bad because I probably could have handled this a little better and just redirected him into asking for descriptions of the people that were missing, but he latched onto pictures of them, and I'm like, these people don't have time to draw pictures, you know, and even if they did, they would probably look like medieval tapestries and that type of thing, and that's not going to help you identify somebody. And then I also had the, look, dude, it's a gigantic forest. If you see a human wandering around alone, you might want to talk to them, because maybe that's your missing person. Either way, I didn't really handle it as well as I should have, and I feel a little bad about that. Either way, they decided to go investigate the suspicious area because it was on the way in the direction they were heading. Now, this was my retooling of the Fingers of Durende adventure from the original Tales of the Old Margrave. I wasn't a big fan of the adventure as written, but when I started working on it, I didn't have the new book to go off of. And I made a really cool map for it, so I kind of wanted to use it. So I ended up taking the whole little adventure and working it into something a little bit more useful. The first encounter they had was them finding the kid sister running away from a bunch of rat folk that worked for the people in the location they were heading. The fight was interesting, but the two tough characters that I had put into this encounter couldn't roll for crap. The rat folk mercenary had 2 attacks around. He got to attack twice. Out of his 4 attacks, he rolled a 1, and a 5. The warlock didn't do much better. And actually, I was trying to get the warlock to escape, and Nevram sent his familiar Blink Dog after him and took him down. So that was that. Now, after they took out all the rat folk, there was this moment that happens in D&D games where they were so focused on the loot, they forgot about the story. And so they got all the loot from the rat folk, and I had put in there a magical dagger, which I fully expected to go to the rogue because the rogue needed a magic weapon for when they run up against stuff that's, resistant to non-magical weapons. Unfortunately, the rogue player lost his connection, and the warlock and the wizard started not arguing, but they started debating who of the two of them should get this magic dagger. And I finally was like, maybe you want to wait until the rogue is back here to have this conversation. At which point the wizard was like, oh, I guess Ange wants the rogue to have the weapon. And I'm like, come on, guys. After this, they were led to the trees like fingers grasping up out of the earth, which is the finger fortress of the whole storyline. There on the ground floor beneath the fortress part of it, which is basically just a giant, really cool tree house, they fought a dryad and an orc and 6 awakened shrubs on the ground floor. This fight was interesting as the dryad turned out to be more challenging than I thought she would, based on her CR. She tried to charm Malvern, but he miraculously made his wisdom save, only to immediately go down when the orc got a crit on him with his great axe. The Dryad then successfully charmed Grish, and Grish's player had to navigate defending the Dryad while still trying to justify not attacking his teammates, which I thought was an interesting little bit of storyline.
Mm-hmm.
This one was not meant to be a hard fight. It was basically just to kind of put them through their paces, because this is the first time I've had them in a series of encounters that they can't just skip and rest before dealing with the next part.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had Binia, the leader of the whole tree fortress thing, taunt them from above. So Zartath sent Ovi, his familiar, up to see what was up there. I then had Binia take a shot at the pseudo-dragon, and she got a crit. So down went the pseudo-dragon. Thank goodness that Ovi is a familiar and can be summoned back, because I would have been feeling super guilty because I introduced this little familiar for him. We are not going to get to play in 2 weeks because I will be out of town. So we're not going to get to the second part of this until a little bit later. But they're definitely going to be going up the tree to try and rescue some people and fight some bad guys.
The GM giveth and the GM taketh away.
I'm really trying to lean into, putting them through their paces and challenging. And Shard has an interesting feature where you can keep all the GM rolls to yourself, or you can roll them and then reveal them to the players. And so I've gotten to the point where I've been revealing when I get a crit, so they know that I'm not pulling punches on them anymore. So I still felt really bad for taking out Ovi.
Yeah. It's a nice familiar you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. In our Thursday Midgard game, our adventurers got to celebrate Hatching Day, which is a Marodi holiday that is celebrating the time of year when the scaled folks most often have their eggs hatch. And they spent a whole lot of money on clothes, and then they went out to eat afterwards. The end. No, we did more than that.
I mean, a whole lot of money? I mean, they're rich.
Yes, but I mean, comparatively, it was a pretty good amount of money.
Oh, yeah.
The Sultana hooked them up with a scholar that is meant to show them the way to their next mission. He knows how to navigate the shadow roads, which are the roads that cut through the plane of shadows and bring 2 points together closer than they would be in the real world. But and they run along the ley lines that are already existent in the world. And he also knows about the temple location that they're going to be exploring, and that it is inscribed with machine speech, which is basically what certain distinctive mechanical things from an alternate plane use to speak, which are definitely not Modrons, because Kobold Press has their own distinctive mechanical things from alternate planes now. The scholar is not a fighter, but he also is very insistent that he is not bad at traveling at all. So he's not going to be a burden to them in any way, shape, or form. And he also let them know that, like, all the other scholars that he knows either died or, ran screaming from this place without having any decent answers other than those vague hints about the machine speech and the strange things going on there. As they were traveling to the site where they're going to enter the Shadow Roads, the scholar got to spend time being nerdy with Marin, because Marin is our scholarly Psi-Knight, and so they were just kind of sitting there going back and forth, talking about things that nobody else in the party actually cared about. But Kazina did pick up that he's feigning being a little bit less serious than he actually is. Nothing more than that, but just the idea that he is being very conscious of the personality that he is projecting to the party as he's traveling with them. They had to travel for a few days to reach the location where the entrance to the Shadow Roads, and just before they made it there, we rolled for them to have an encounter, and they ran into a group of Thac0 giants. These are giants that specifically make, like, arms and armor and weaponry for other giants. They are kind of in between size. They're large size giants, so sometimes they will make, things for humanoids and things like that, but they are basically artificers for hire. The group ran into them and found out that this is tied into another encounter that they had when they first got to Valera, which is they ran into a Minotaur artificer that was selling magic items and telling them, if anyone comes looking for me, don't tell them where I'm at. The Minotaur had apprenticed with this Thac0 for a while and left when she realized that these were not particularly nice people. And the Thac0 came looking because he wanted to get back the knowledge that she stole. When Marin asked how they were planning on getting this knowledge back once she already had it, the Thac0 leader shows him that his belt made out of dwarf skulls, which basically were skulls that he could crush and then absorb the souls of these dwarves, and he was planning on just cutting off the Minotaur's head and keeping her around so he could absorb her soul. At this point, they decided the fact that they wanted to get into a fight probably wasn't a bad thing. The giants had a bunch of bronze golems with them. So this was a big fight between golems and giants and RPCs. This is another one of those things. I want them to feel like they are badasses at 12th level. So, fighting a band of giants that also has some golems with them is perfectly all right with me. Bronze golems aren't really like massive CR anyway. I think there's like CR3 or something like that. So they're not like meant to be deadly like, iron golems or anything like that.
They had absolutely disturbing aspect to them, though, that didn't actually come into play, though.
Yes, and I had to at least explain once Marin was grappled by one so that it set it up to happen. They open up their chest cavities and put you inside, and their internal steam just like boils you once you're trapped inside their chest cavity. It's a neat feature. It's one of those things, though, like when your villains don't get a chance to show off what they can do, sometimes I just really want the PCs to know what they could do. So explaining that cavity opened up and was ready to trap Marin in it, at least got to describe the horror of seeing this cavity open up and the steam pouring out, and how it's like basically just built to fit someone to be, set inside of it and closed up again. Kratatup turned into a mammoth and got some good tramples in. Ivy got to use her ridiculously large cone spell, and also her Starfall that makes the DM cry for his NPCs spell, which blinds and knocks prone multiple opponents. And I apologize to Ange because the bronze golems were immune to psychic damage again.
At least it's not like the fight that never happened.
We didn't go back to that. And also, it was the bronze golems. It wasn't everything in the fight. Plus, as you alluded to in your game, you have an item now that is magical so that if you can't use your psychic knives, you can still stab things and get your sneak attack in. The scholar did make himself useful by catching all the horses which were spooked during the fight. And next time we're going to start with them entering the Shadow Roads.
It should be a good time.
Welcome to the Dungeon Master's Workshop.
Moving on into the Dungeon Master's Workshop, dungeons are a staple in, well, Dungeons and Dragons. Why? Like Gwen DeMarco in Galaxy Quest, there are times we sometimes scream, why is this here? Who put it here? What purpose does it serve? Does it even make sense? Did a wizard do it? We're going to take a look at dungeon ecology and how you can design dungeons for your games that make sense supporting the residents your players will find inside of them. So why did dungeons end up becoming a thing in D&D anyway?
I think when you look at some of the earliest foundational fantasy media that inspired the people that created the game, you have Conan going to all of these different ruined locations, which are essentially dungeons in, basically this old city of broken down things where he will run into weird monsters and, hey, look, treasure. You have Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser in those stories. There were multiple times they would raid like evil temples in order to find treasure or to steal it back from these terrible people so that they could, spend money with other terrible people. And then you also have things like Smaug's Lair in The Hobbit, which is pretty much a dungeon. I mean, it isn't just the place where Smaug was at. They had to sneak in. There was a secret entrance. A lot of the trappings that we normally see in dungeons now. And then there is the world's first mega dungeon, Moria, which is basically an underground city haunted by lots of different monsters, including orcs and a Balrog.
Yeah.
Sorry, spoilers.
Yeah, I think that all of those things were part of the genre of fantasy, epic fantasy before D&D became D&D, and it was probably easy to add those to the games as the game was being developed and formed. So now that we know the inspiration, why are they so quintessential to D&D?
I think it is a lot simpler to present an adventure location by saying, here are 10 different spots that are all connected in very specific ways that I can keep track of, and then I can have my numbered list that tells me what's in each one of those spots. It is a very classic, very simple way to summarize an adventure.
If you consider a new GM sitting down to run a game, what's going to be easier for them to handle? A large open world in which the players can choose to go in any direction, or a specific dungeon which might have 2 or 3 paths or hallways, but has everything detailed for them to basically put in front of the players as the players get to it. It really is easier to put that in front of players, and I think that became kind of shorthand for a lot of adventure design, to just put the characters in a dungeon. It's a constrained little area that gives the players all the stuff the game is supposed to give, but makes it easier on the GM.
And it's also kind of interesting when you look at like everything that they formatted like a dungeon in early D&D, because there were literally underground areas where there's just this room that's connected to this room that is more traditionally what we think of as a dungeon. But there were also like, okay, here's a ruined city. Here's this building that is building A. Here's this building that's over by this walkway that's building B. So like these ruined cities would be laid out, even though they were larger scale, they were laid out like a dungeon would be laid out.
I think that leads into our next question, which is, what do we mean when we call something a dungeon? At least as far as the game goes.
A dungeon, at least as far as D&D goes, is a constrained space where you have limited options for where you enter and exit any given location.
Yep.
It is basically a collection of rooms that have things in them.
And this can be anything from, your traditional like crypts that people are exploring, the ruined city underneath the castle, the mega dungeon that sprawls a large chunk of the Underdark, or as Jared was just saying, it could be just a city that has been laid out like a dungeon.
And an Expedition of the Barrier Peaks, a spaceship.
What do we mean when we refer to dungeon ecology?
Ecology is basically the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So what we're talking about here is, how do these things in the dungeon live and survive and react to their environment and the other things that live in the dungeon with them?
It's the idea that, back in the day, people would, make dungeons and they would just populate them with whatever seemed cool at the time and not really think about why. That Gwen DeMarco quote, why is this here? Why does this exist? Why is this here? Does it even make sense in the grand scheme of the world these characters are living in?
And what's interesting is, like, the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide literally just had a section for, if you haven't pre-made your dungeon, you can just roll and see what that next room is. Now, that had a whole giant section on that, and that definitely did not lead to coherent dungeons, but it was a good way for you, if you were brand new, to figure out, okay, this is what's in the next room.
Yeah. When and why did we start becoming concerned about dungeon ecology? Because, obviously you said first edition D&D said, here's a table, roll if you don't know what's in the next room. That has no acknowledgement of ecology at all.
I don't think that it was that people were never thinking about it. I do think in a lot of cases it was an afterthought. Oh, whoops, would this thing actually fit in here? Some of the earliest ways you saw people addressing that was basically to say, hey, this is a magical world, so it got here magically. There was an explanation, it just wasn't a great explanation. I think I really saw the term dungeon ecology, and I am not saying this is where it started, because I tried to research this and find it out, and I could not find a definitive source that said this is where it started. But I first started hearing about dungeon ecology when people would talk about things in 3rd edition, because that seemed to be an instance where people were a lot more interested in saying, hey, wait, this shouldn't be able to survive in this location unless I can get out and do this. And that was where people started to really kind of pick things apart and say, this couldn't happen because this is here. I'm not saying that was the first time any game designers ever thought about it, but because we're talking about the early 2000s and message boards, this is the first time I remember really seeing a lot of people collectively discussing it.
Yeah, I think if you go back to adventures from 1st and 2nd edition, you will find the ones that have a dungeon where things make sense, where it is designed to extend the theme of the adventure or play with what the characters are supposed to be engaged with. The good ones are probably all fairly solid on their dungeon ecology. It's just that was, I would say, one person or a couple of people designing that adventure, thinking about it without the game itself saying, hey, this is something you should consider.
When we're talking about the ruined cities and everything, that is almost an easier thing to justify, because most of those, it was like, here's this big building where this thing is at, but it wasn't that you couldn't leave that building. So things that lived in the building could go out and hunt and do whatever they needed to. It was just laid out like a dungeon. So here's the building. This is what lives in the building. So in those cases, those dungeons really weren't, a problem.
I did get burned by dungeon ecology back in the 3.5 days. I made a character that was basically a beguiler, which was a 3rd edition kind of combination of a rogue and an illusionist. And I did not realize that the GM was going to put us in a dungeon that consisted solely of undead, because that's what made sense. What would be in this dungeon? Let's design it. It's the only thing that would live here and still be down here in these lower depths would be the undead. And I got a, beguiler as a halfling character, which meant my weapon did no damage to the undead because they were mostly skeletons, and I had a piercing weapon that did half damage because I was a halfling, and so I was maybe doing 1 or 2 points of damage. And then my illusions were absolutely useless because it was all undead. And that was one of those games that taught me the purpose of a session 0, so that the GM can explain, kind of a little of where should you go making these characters.
Kids, if you're young enough that you don't understand why some of this was a problem, third edition liked to tell us that the undead didn't have physiology, therefore rogues were completely useless against them and got no sneak attack. Also, they had like a general trait where I think undead were almost universally immune to illusions. Like they couldn't, if they couldn't sense life in them, then they knew they were an illusion immediately too.
Yeah,
So
they were absolutely immune to any illusion powers, and they were resistant to piercing weapons.
yeah, so yeah, that's kind of rough. That's
The
kind of rough.
one thing I ran into in that dungeon that wasn't an undead was a mimic that pretty much almost ate my character, and I had to be rescued by the other party members.
Oh goodness.
I'm not bitter.
No, not at all. I did want to touch on a concept that did, and I believe this term predates dungeon ecology and everything else, but the term funhouse dungeon. What that is basically a dungeon where the purpose is that there is a lot of weird stuff that doesn't make sense room after room after room. In some cases, even though there are big story reasons for it, Undermountain is a funhouse dungeon because there's just a lot of weird stuff. You know, you go from one level to the other and it's not consistent. It's a whole different theme to this next level that you go to. So that's kind of what the funhouse dungeon concept is. It's that anything can happen in the next room.
And I mean, Undermountain is a little weird because there's so many levels to it. But yeah, I would agree. It's all whatever because a wizard did it. White Plume Mountain. White Plume Mountain is very similar. It's just, why the hell is this here?
I think there's also like there literally is the explanation in some of these cases that a wizard did it. I think having Hallister make Undermountain was probably the most detailed version of that. But the problem with a lot of early edition things was also that even if it said in the text that a wizard did it, the players were never going to figure that out because there was nothing in the adventure that communicated that to them. It just told the DM, okay, it's fine. Just roll with this story. It's good. But there was no way to communicate that to the players.
I will say in the 5th edition version of Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is the 5th edition version of Undermountain, you do run into these portals that kind of connect the different levels. And very early on, we accidentally triggered one that had our sorcerer end up in front of Hallister, who was like, what the hell are you doing here? Go back. And like booted her back out of the portal. As players, we all knew that a wizard did it. But this also, like that moment kind of solidified for the characters that a wizard did it.
The funny thing is, Undermountain is literally Ed Greenwood seeing other funhouse dungeons and saying, I am going to Greenwood this dungeon. And by that, I mean, I am going to provide hundreds of pages of lore explaining why this thing can actually exist. But to his credit, like, Undermountain is a thing that people know exists. Like, people pay money to go down the well in the Yawning Portal to go explore Undermountain, and they know that Hallister made it. They also know that it used to be Dwarven ruins. It was built on top of this, that's built on top of this. So it is something where at least the history of it is understood and known.
So, little tangent on Dungeon of the Mad Mage, Undermountain in 5th edition. Whoever did the parts in that book that involve the drow really like the drow. Because every single drow has a name and a paragraph of history. Even if they're just mooks that you're going to mow down and never actually find out what their name is. Every single one is detailed and given like personality and description. And our GM who was running it, he's like, yeah, you just murdered. They believe in this and they wanted this out of life. Every single section that had drow was so super detailed on who these characters are. Meanwhile, we're lucky if we have one goblin with an actual name.
This person that you just killed was 2 weeks from retirement.
What is Gygaxian naturalism and how does that fit into all of this?
What's really interesting, I just mentioned, you know, the greenwooding of a mega dungeon and how Ed Greenwood approaches that, which is by putting on tons of layers of lore. Gygax did also have his own reasons that he kind of wanted to explain how things worked in a dungeon. And a lot of that is expressed in the types of monsters you see that have no reason to exist if dungeons are not a thing that happen a lot in the world. Having a predator that is a clear gelatinous cube that nobody sees in a square hallway is something that only develops if dungeons are a thing. So really what that Gygaxian naturalism is talking about is that, okay, if there's dungeons all over the place and creatures started to develop, this is what happens. These are creatures that were specifically evolved just to hunt and survive in dungeons. Mimics are another example of this. Basically like, hey, if adventurers keep coming down here looking for treasure chests, if we can look like treasure chests, we'll get to eat adventurers.
See, I've always liked the gelatinous cube explanation that they're basically the Roomba of the dungeon.
Yeah. The other thing that is not super pleasant to think about, but it is definitely where they come from. Yugs eat waste. That was the explanation for why you didn't see different creatures waste, all over in the dungeon if there were living things in there.
Because the teenagers of the 80s playing this, they needed to know about the poop.
I mean, it's better than magicking it away when you're standing there having a conversation with somebody, but we won't even get into that. It is interesting, though, because it shows that Gygax was thinking about some of these things, but like a lot of things with Gygax, if you didn't have his exact perspective, sometimes it's not like you looked at these things and said, oh, it all makes sense now.
Yeah.
It's something that made sense to him.
I think there's a lot of things like that in Dungeons and Dragons. Like, what? Why? Why is this here? I love the story that there are so many of the classic monsters that were based on a pack of Japanese plastic monster toys.
Yes. I remember seeing like those weird little random packs of monsters in grocery stores that would sit on that 5x5 section where they put the kids' toys so you'd stand there while your mom was grocery shopping.
Yep. So beyond monsters, what other things are typical that players should expect to find in dungeons?
Once you start talking about once you start talking about any dungeon, there's going to be traps in it. That is almost a given for a dungeon. Something has to be trapped. Now, traps do play back into dungeon ecology because if a trap is constantly going off, it means that living things probably either know how to disarm it or would be constantly getting killed by it. Beyond that, though, like, you youngsters, you don't know how many magic fountains there were in dungeons back in the day. Because a lot of early designers liked the idea of, hey, you want to drink from that? You want to see what's going to happen? Hey, why don't you drink from that?
This is why in Baldur's Gate 3, in the opening part of the game, where you find that portal and you hear a voice inside the portal asking for you to help them out, and you see a hand come out, I was like, no, because if this were an old school game, I would lose my hand or I would die. This is the point I die. And then I remembered, nope, this is not an old school game. Let's do the thing and see what happens. Worst comes to worst, I reload my game because there were a lot of things in those old dungeons that were intended to kill you.
The interesting thing, too, about like the fountains and things like that, it wasn't that they were all bad. It's that they were probably 50-50, which almost made it worse. Because it's like, either I'm going to drink from this and I'm going to get like 2 points of strength, or I'm going to drink from this and my entire body is going to disintegrate. But the other thing that was kind of interesting about that, though, is these fountains were kind of a built-in long rest in some cases, because there were fountains in some dungeons where it's like, if you drink from this, you get back all your hit points, but you don't get back all your hit points again for another 24 hours. So it was that way of resetting your character while they were exploring the dungeon.
There were also puzzles.
Yes.
Puzzles were a big part of dungeons in having to do the puzzle to open the next door or just reveal a treasure trove or something along those lines.
And the funny thing is, I know a lot of this came from like the serials that were playing like in the 40s movie theaters and things like that, because that's where, George Lucas got inspired for these sorts of things. But a lot of this plays into like Indiana Jones type things too. Indiana Jones has explored dungeons. The only thing he hasn't done is fought dragons in them. And there's probably a book or a comic book with that in it somewhere too. The other thing that I think is interesting is teleporters were a big thing in a lot of older dungeons. I mean, they still exist in some dungeons. I'm just saying that that was a big thing because in some cases the teleporters were a puzzle. Like if you stepped on this teleporter, it took you to this room and you had no idea where you were at in the dungeon, and you literally couldn't get anywhere else in the dungeon except to find where the next teleporter was to take you back to somewhere where you could get out of the dungeon again.
You know, as a slight tangent, some of these things, traps, puzzles, random weird magical things like a fountain or stuff, some of these I think work better in video games. You know, it can be hard to implement some of these in a traditional TTRPG. And I love puzzles up to a point in video games. And that point is when I get frustrated and then I go look up how to solve it online. But it's like these things are like, they work really well in video game exploration dungeons and that type of thing. And I'm never satisfied with them in a face-to-face tabletop RPG.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, I like things like that better when they're a little more abstracted instead of like literally saying, this is exactly the puzzle and this is exactly what happens, as opposed to, in general, this is what this is about. How do you want to go about solving it?
Yeah, and you end up with the problem with some of these if you learn as a GM, never lock the adventure behind a door the players may not be able to open. And a lot of times you'll see people put a puzzle or a trap or something in there that the players need to solve or deal with before they can advance. And if that ends up being too frustrating or the players fail or whatever, you've just blown all the steam out of your game and now you're kind of stuck. And it works better in a video game because if I get frustrated with that puzzle, I can just go look up how to solve it. If I die because of that trap, I can just reload my game. But in a TTRPG, you want to have these cool things in there that add the flavor to the dungeon, but you want to be careful about how they're implemented so that the players can still progress the story even if the dice are against them. What is necessary in a dungeon for players to suspend their disbelief, i.e. for us to have a dungeon ecology that makes sense?
This is definitely going to vary based on your players, because there are things that are logical that you need to think about that most people are going to think about if they spend any time pondering how things work. And that is, where do they get their food? Where do they get water? Where are the living spaces? Not just this room where, the monsters are ready to fight you, but like if they're humanoids or beasts or something, they need to sleep somewhere. They probably want to keep their stuff somewhere. Where are the entrances and exits? A lot of times things need to get out of the dungeon to be able to, just go out and gather more food or whatever. Also, I mean, how do things react to each other? If there's a slime pit 2 doors down from where the hobgoblins have their barracks, how does that work? Like, how do they not wake up covered in slime? Those are kind of the basic things. You will have some players at your table that are a lot more science-minded. And there are things about dungeons that make even less sense when you really think about it, because it is very difficult to get airflow into deep caverns. There might be enough air for like 1 or 2 people that go spelunking. There would not be enough air for a tribe of grimlocks that lives in there. The idea that air is going to be able to get in there is something we kind of take for granted, but it may not necessarily be true given how things actually work. A lot of times it gets really hot in an enclosed underground space like that, and we don't necessarily think about that, and it might be too warm for somebody that's used to, being on the surface to actually survive in that kind of environment for too long.
Yeah.
These are kind of things that they are true, but they're not necessarily things that we think about as much as some of those other things.
I think as a GM, these are the type of things you want to at least think about cursorily. Because if your players are going to be like, well, wait, this doesn't make any sense, you want to be able to have an answer for why, it might make sense, or even if you do resort to a wizard did it, you still want to be able to have, an understanding of why, how, why, what is this here and why does it exist?
That's the main thing. Like, you have to think on the base level, like, how is this going to function? You don't expect people to need a physics lesson on how dragons could actually fly in the setting. But if you just say, like, some random kid jumped off a cliff and can fly, they're going to be like, well, why? How does that work? Because human children don't normally fly.
And I mean, this to bring in comic books because we have to. This is like the people who go like, well, Ant-Man couldn't actually survive because he would turn into that size and he would implode because of blah, 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 blah. Like, I don't care about your physics. There's levels of suspension of disbelief that I have for the various fantastical genres we engage with. Which brings me to my next question. Does every dungeon have to make sense? How beholden to reality should we be with our dungeons?
I think it depends on what your dungeon is doing. I think there's a good example in the Book of Many Things that came out not last Christmas, but the Christmas before that is all about, things related to the Deck of Many Things. One of the things that is presented in there is this dungeon that is made up of large-sized cards from the Deck of Many Things. And it is obvious that this is a construct that has sprung forth from someone tampering with the Deck of Many Things. And in that case, it is thematic. It doesn't have to make sense because it has a theme that plays back to this. Oh, we are dealing with a Deck of Many Things. This is a dungeon made out of giant cards. Okay, that makes sense. That kind of replaces the suspension of disbelief that you need for a dungeon making sense.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're putting in front of your players. Are you putting in front of them an underground warren where goblins or kobolds live? You should probably make sure that makes at least a little bit of sense for how they actually live there. But if we're talking a pocket dimension in between the Feywild and the Shadowfell, maybe not so much. It really depends on what you're putting in front of your players. And some of this can change depending upon what tier you're playing at. If you are playing at lower levels, if you're playing in that first through fourth level, your dungeon should probably make some sense because your players' characters are not going to be dealing with the super fantastical stuff just yet. The higher in level they get, the weirder stuff can become.
I think my baseline is, especially when there are less magical things, like when you have, things that are beasts, when you have things that are monstrosities, when you have humanoids, my bare minimum is they need a place to sleep. Generally, things don't sleep in places where they're planning on fighting and murdering people. I know this was a joke. This was a joke that my players used to get on me for. I put a privy in almost every dungeon level that had humanoids on it at some point in time, just because, I'm sitting here thinking they got to do something. So
I played The Sims before. You got to give them a toilet.
Exactly. Even if you're not super worried about showing how they get their food, showing that they have a place that they store food is probably a good idea. The other thing that doesn't always occur to people is the hobgoblins are in this room over here. Well, if the hobgoblins are in that room, wouldn't they send out patrols? Wouldn't they be walking around the place once in a while? So you may want to add in maybe having a random encounter so that these things that are intelligent creatures that live there will actually be patrolling this area and looking around for things.
So what do we need to keep in mind with dungeons that lean more into the fantastical aspects of D&D?
Like I said, with that Deck of Many Things themed dungeon, sometimes theme can trump logic.
Mm-hmm.
If something is a very strong theme, people will buy into it because it is basically, we know we're telling a story. We're playing a storytelling game. If something is going along with the moral of the story or the theme of the story, we will buy into it more so than if it's just this random thing that you're telling them doesn't work the way it should work and just hoping that they run with it.
It should make sense in the scope of the world. If nothing truly fantastical has happened to the characters yet, introducing a dungeon that is completely detached from the reality of the setting might be a bit too jarring. You kind of want to... I don't think you necessarily need to build up to them depending upon what you're doing with the game, but you got to be careful when you You go from, it's a gritty world that, you're barely surviving in, to now you're in a fantastical dungeon that doesn't actually, has gaping giant pits around it and magical illusionary stairs and random weirdness like that.
This is one of those places where if you look back to the old school inspirations, it's probably a good place to look, because when Conan is looking through those ruins, or Fafhrd and Mauser are raiding that temple, there's not like 10 different weird things. There might be like a trap and something interesting that they don't understand and a monster. That isn't necessarily what I think you need through all levels of play in D&D, because things need to get ridiculous by the time your characters are 20th level. But when you're talking about those low-level characters, yeah, you don't need to have everything being weird and fantastical. If you're running that, 5-room dungeon for your first level characters just so that they can get their feet wet in adventuring, you don't necessarily need that monster in every room. It's the thing that caps off the whole thing. That's the thing that's memorable at the end of the dungeon.
So let's take a moment and talk about the dungeon's denizen. What types of things can you do with the creatures that live in a dungeon?
Anytime you have intelligent creatures and you have two different societies or groupings of them, you're going to have to think about how they deal with each other. D&D, actually, I honestly think this is part of how this developed, but part of this logic is of goblins in D&D is the goblins all kind of like the regular goblins listen to the hobgoblins take orders from the bugbears. That was kind of an inbuilt thing where if your dungeon has all three of these monsters in it, they get along sort of because they're supposed to, because that's goblin society, even though it's three different species of goblin. But yeah, if you have like a bunch of grimlocks that live in a place and kobolds, how do the kobolds and the grimlocks get along?
Mm-hmm.
Do the kobolds do jobs for the grimlocks to keep the peace between them? Do they hide from the grimlocks whenever they show up? These are the kind of things that you kind of need to think about whenever you have intelligent creatures in there. The other thing, we alluded to this before, if there's oozes in your, you want these oozes to randomly, go through this place, how do the people that live there deal with the oozes? Like, how do they avoid waking up with their head gone because the ooze sat on their face in the middle of the night? This is the kind of stuff that you need to think about. And sometimes it leads you to doing some neat stuff, because you might have this thing where like the hobgoblins have built like this glass thing that, they put up against their door so that the oozes just flow past their door every time because they can't eat through glass or something like that. It can actually be an inspirational thing that makes the dungeon almost more fantastical, but not fantastical in a, oh, this is magic way, but in a, this is how something I have never had to think about would function when there are life forms that we don't have on this planet.
There was a level in Dungeon of the Mad Mage that is fairly deep, and it has basically drow and minotaurs, and they're at war with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And the minotaurs are trying to raise a demon, and the drow are basically trying to kill all the minotaurs. And you, as the players, kind of stumble into the middle of this chaos and have to deal with the fact that they're really kind of busy dealing with each other, but that doesn't mean they're not going to take time to just try and wipe you out. It helps to take a look at these things and like, why are they here? What are they doing?
And honestly, this is the other thing. If you want to explain why there's no waste anywhere, then you can start logically assuming, hey, maybe the hobgoblins have tamed a few Otyugs. Like the Otyugs are basically pets to them, and they clean up things behind them. But also, like, if you go into the hobgoblin lair and you go into the wrong cave, unfortunately, here are these trained Otyugs that are very loyal to the hobgoblins that have been taking care of them for all these years. You get to the point to where some things are basically symbiotic. It's not that these two monsters are fighting one another. It's not that these two monsters are negotiating with each other. It's that they literally play off of each other and make it a deeper experience because those two things logically start to function together.
So final question here. What if you don't like dungeons? Do you have to use them in a fantasy RPG?
No, you do not. I would specifically say you don't need big dungeons especially. I do think there is a little bit to D&D where once in a while you're probably going to want a constrained area with a couple rooms where you have something going on. But as far as like, do you need to drop something like the Tomb of Annihilation into a campaign, or do you need people to wander into the ruins of Castle Greyhawk? No, you do not need that.
Yeah. I don't like mega dungeons. I find them incredibly boring. That's me as a player. As a GM, I struggle to run dungeons. I struggle to run large dungeons because, like, it's boring. You know, like, if it's a smaller, several rooms connected to each other for a purpose, yeah, that's great. That's great because it can be really good to put the PCs through their paces and exhaust their resources as you have them have to deal with these chained encounters, so they don't get a chance to do a short rest or a long rest before the next fight. Because you will run into issues if the players never have to do more than one encounter, at a time. Because, we'll just long rest and they'll get all the resources back and be able to blow everything up. It's part of the game to have them have to manage those resources so that they can keep going when they have to. And dungeons can give you that option.
I think at some point we should probably touch on 5-room dungeons because I think both of us are much more likely to use that design strategy, which does not literally necessarily mean 5 rooms, but it is the fact that you have this short, constrained area that is where you want your PCs to go as part of an adventure.
The one I keep thinking of is from the Depths of Zendrick campaign I ran, where I had the Medusa and the Yuan-Ti, and that pretty much worked out to be like a 5 or 6 room dungeon. They had an opening area where they had to deal with the guard snake, and then they had some areas that kind of gave them some lore, and then they had a room where they saw the captives being turned into the brood creatures. And then that led into a fight in the main room. The next room led into a room where the guards to the underchamber where the Medusa was. And then finally they had the big Medusa fight. That's kind of what I mean by, like, it doesn't need to be a massive dungeon, but you do need to occasionally engage with enclosed spaces where the players kind of have to conserve their resources and deal with things on a tactical level.
It is interesting because it almost is the evolution of the game that in early AD&D, the dungeon was the adventure. Like, you're assumed you get to the dungeon, now you're exploring it. But by the time you got to the Dragonlance adventures, Thac0 is not the adventure. That is where they go after they find out the world's at war and they're dealing with Draconians, and like there are all these story beats while they are traveling. And then Thac0 is almost, it's not really an afterthought because it's still important that they explore it, but it is part of the story. It is not, the point isn't that these adventurers wanted to explore Thac0, it's that they needed to find the Discs of Meshachel in Thac0. So there is a very story-based point to that, and I think that is kind of how D&D evolved away from here is the dungeon, which is also the adventure, to here is a dungeon, which is inside an adventure.
Now let's join Ange and Jared for some downtime research, where they do the work so we don't have to.
Every episode, we're going to look for something related to D&D that we want to pass along to the listeners. It might be products, websites, videos, or podcasts, but it will always be something that we think will enhance your D&D experience. And now, our Eldritch Invocation. We have a Patreon now, so if you would like to help us do the show and provide additional content for you, we would love it if you decided to join. We've got our own Discord, and we'll be releasing a lot of different supplementary material. We have bonus spells, magic items. We have interesting information from the actual play campaign that we go through. You can see the NPCs that we used that were helping us in the Heroes of Havel's Way. There's so much stuff. You should become our patron. And also, my standing offer is still in there. We will hex anyone that you want us to hex. We won't Eldritch Blast them. We've been told we can't do that. I will totally hex someone for you, though. You can find us at www.patreon.com/THAC0WA.
So let's talk about a pretty major fantasy-adjacent announcement. 7th Sea has been a beloved game setting combining high seas adventure and magic since 1999. There was a massively successful Kickstarter for a second edition in 2016, but after the main book came out, it kind of fell into a little bit of scandal and drama because there was so much promised and not enough delivered. In 2019, Chaosium acquired the license for the property and kind of picked up work on some of the undelivered products. This year, on July 15th, Chaosium announced that Studio Agate has taken over development of the game. This is pretty interesting, as Studio Agate has been working on the French version of the game since 2017, and they have begun publishing English adventures as well. They've announced a Patreon that will kind of serve as a developer diary, and they've got a community survey up. We will have a link to the press release in our show notes.
I really, really love 7th Sea. I had a really great campaign of it that I ran, and another one that was fun that never really finished up the way the first one did. There are issues with 2nd edition that I have with it, but I would actually really love to see those issues just fixed instead of scrapping it and starting from zero again.
It's going to be 10 years next year for 2nd edition.
Yeah.
So I could see them basically just trying to make a 3rd edition. I also have some issues. The campaign I played in lasted two sessions. And it had some issues that were separate from the game itself, but the game itself also had some problems that we were seeing even in those early stages. Primarily experience. I didn't like how the game handled that, but there were a lot of other aspects that I really, really liked. And I'm still very sad that campaign died on the vine.
There's a lot of high concept things that probably needed to get reined in a little bit. Not completely, but a little bit.
Yeah.
For the thing I would like to bring up today, I'm going to be the sad, serious one here. You may have heard that Diamond Distributors are in bankruptcy right now. Diamond used to handle like DC and Marvel. Both of them left a while ago, but they were still distributing a lot of the RPGs and, some smaller companies with dice and card games. They distributed just about everybody in the hobby market that we see now. So like basically your Fantasy Flights, your Wizards of the Coast. As far as RPGs go, people like Paizo and Green Ronin. They were a big deal. In recent years, Wizards also moved away from them, which probably didn't help them going into bankruptcy here, but they are in bankruptcy. And here's where things get really interesting, because they have petitioned the bankruptcy judge to let them sell the consigned stock that they still have in their warehouses to pay off the banks that they owe. If you don't know, consigned stock is they don't own that. They didn't buy that from the companies. They have that, and if they moved it along to hobby shops, they get part of the cost of them because they sold, but they don't own any of that stock. That's all stuff they're holding for those companies. So letting them sell this stuff off is basically taking money out of the pockets of all of these game developers and handing it straight to the banks to pay off Diamond's bankruptcy. Now, if you're wondering, is this legal? Yes, sort of. It's a weird thing when it comes to judges being able to order things to resolve bankruptcies. There's a lot of weird ins and outs there. Do I think personally that you should be able to steal from a game company in order to pay off a gigantic bank that will not at all feel the fact that they didn't get paid? No, because those game companies are really hurting if you do that to them.
Legal? Maybe. Moral? No.
Exactly. What that brings us to is Green Ronin has started a GoFundMe for their legal defense fund. They want to sue to say, no, that's our stock. They should not be able to sell this. That's going to be a financial hardship on us if you take our stuff and give it to these banks, essentially. This is something I think is important, not just to defend Green Ronin, but because I think it's important for there to be a legal precedent of there to be these game companies actually putting their foot down and saying, no, we cannot afford this. You can't take this from us. And if somebody wins this court case, that makes it more likely that other companies will be able to step up and do that same thing and protect themselves from just having their own material that they own ripped out of their hands and sold to somebody else.
Yeah.
I believe Paizo even said like they won't have half of their stock for Gen Con because it's all tied up in this diamond mess right now. It's affecting a lot of companies, but Green Ronin set up that legal defense fund. We're going to have a link to it if you would like to contribute. I think it's actually a really important thing.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important. Moving on out of here, we are happily part of the Polygamers Podcast Network, helping you run and play your best games. We think you'll enjoy another Polygamers podcast like
Pandas Talking Games. Queer gamers talking about tabletop role-playing games and making outtakes. Join Pandas Phil and Senda every other Wednesday, answering listener questions about playing, running, and designing TTRPGs. It's like Car Talk, but for your games.
We have used up all of our resources, so I think it's time for a long rest. I hope this adventure was rewarding for you, and we hope you go exploring with us when we start our next one.